Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the season review for the 23-24 San Jose Sharks. But the story of this season actually starts a couple of years ago when the Sharks originally hired Mike Grier as new general manager for the organization. And at the time, he was pretty adamant in not using the word rebuild when it came to the direction he wanted to take this franchise in. And he seemed to be more in that retool type of camp that a lot of GMs frustratingly fall into because they don't want to admit that they're going to have to be bad for a few years before being good again. Now, retool was something that the Sharks had done with some success in the past, primarily in 2015. That was a year in which the Sharks missed the playoffs 1 year after they had lost in the first round to the Los Angeles Kings in reverse sweep fashion. And at the time, Doug Wilson had said famously that the Sharks would have to take a step back to take 2 steps forward. And it worked out quite well for them back then, as that year they would draft Timo Meier in the first round. They'd sign both Joe Ward and Paul Martin. They'd make a trade to acquire a new starting goaltender in Martin Jones, and it would lead to the Sharks' most successful season as an organization, with a Stanley Cup Finals appearance that following year in 2016, before unfortunately losing out to the Pittsburgh Penguins. But that was a team that still featured legendary pieces like Joe Thornton, Patrick Marleau, and Joe Pavelski. This time around, those legendary pieces were nowhere to be found, and it seemed as though the only correct choice for the franchise was to go in that rebuilding direction. And so while Mike Grier was quite stubborn in not admitting and using the direct word rebuild, the moves that he was making did seem to lead to the idea that he was really going to be taking the franchise in that way. The first of which would be the Brent Burns move. Now, you could argue at the time that this was just a trade to get out from under an $8 million contract. The value that he ended up getting back in return was a bit suspect, but it was just clearing out cap space that perhaps he could make a move with. But in hindsight, it is quite clear that was just the first of many big trades that Mike Grier would do to get rid of the large contracts that the Sharks have to make room for the rebuild that the Sharks would end up going through. And it became even more clear during that ongoing season when Mike Grier traded away Timo Meier. You do not move on from a mid-20s elite forward like Timo Meier and only get back futures in return like Shakir Mukhamadullin and a couple of first-round draft picks if you aren't in strictly that rebuilding camp. And so when this past offseason rolled around, the direction for San Jose was much clearer. They were going to try and lose games this season. And they actually got a bit lucky, actually very, very lucky that past year when Erik Karlsson exploded for a 101-point season and ended up winning the trophy for the league's best defenseman. This allowed this contract to actually become a bit more of an asset for San Jose, and they ended up trading him to the Pittsburgh Penguins for a first-round pick, amongst a few other cap-dump players like Jan Rutta and Mikael Granlund. This was a contract that seemed unmovable that Mike Grier kind of fell quite luckily into actually being able to get rid of it. Another key piece in moving towards that rebuilding situation. Erik Karlsson was so good that particular year that he single-handedly willed the Sharks over the finish line to multiple victories, which one could argue kept them out of that top 3, which was so coveted at that year's draft. And so this past season, expectations for San Jose were exceptionally low due to all of these moves made. Most people felt as though the Sharks would finish dead last in the league, and they ended up being quite correct in that regard. Personally, I actually felt as though my expectations were slightly higher for San Jose. Obviously not any playoff aspirations, but I thought they'd end up repeating what they did last season with another similar 4th or 5th last type of finish. The reason for that was quite simple. It was not because I felt as though the goaltending got any better. That was still a massive question mark, and clearly the defense had gotten worse. But the one thing that the San Jose Sharks seem to have going for them, and it's a pretty important piece at the NHL level, is their center depth. They would have in their top 6 both Tomas Hertl and Logan Couture, who were still effective players at the NHL level from what we had seen that past season. As their third line center, they would then have Mikael Granlund, who, while many would argue was a bit past his prime, could end up creating mismatches on the third line, kind of like what the Sharks had with Joe Thornton a few years prior to that, and then have Nico Sturm as the fourth line center. Many teams would kill to have a fourth line center like Nico Sturm because he's pretty much the exact build for that type of player. Strong defensively, very good on the faceoffs, and just generally an extremely responsible player in that particular role. That center depth, I thought, could carry the Sharks to at least a couple more victories on that season to keep them out of that last place spot. What I did not foresee, and what pretty much nobody foresaw, was the unexpected injury to Logan Couture that would keep him out for pretty much the entire season. The Sharks captain only played 6 games this year. And so the one positive that the Sharks maybe could have had, which was that centerman depth, was completely eliminated, which left the San Jose Sharks with a roster that would make an AHL team disappointed to see at this point. Now, more specifically, what went wrong? Well, let's start off with how the season started. I remember last year, I talked about how the Sharks opened the year with 5 straight losses and how that was a pretty big hole to dig out of to start the year. Well, this season, the Sharks instead set or tied an NHL record for 11 straight losses to open the year. If 5 losses was a big hole to dig out of, 11 straight losses is essentially the Grand Canyon of holes to dig out of. It was quite clear because of this that by the time November rolled around, that not only would the San Jose Sharks not be competing for a playoff spot, they were so far from it, but that the Sharks had pretty much already locked down a bottom 2 or 3 spot in the entire league, with many people feeling very justified in their expectations of the Sharks finishing dead last. And what's pretty crazy about this is that the Sharks' 11-game losing streak to start the season wasn't even their worst losing streak of the year, as later on they would lose 12 straight. And even then, there was another almost double-digit losing streak as they would lose 9 straight again later on. It basically was a season of when it rained, it poured for the San Jose Sharks, as it would just continuously snowball into loss after loss after loss, which would only be broken out of by like some stroke of good luck and magic of them managing to win a game. Otherwise, it was like some self-fulfilling prophecy where the team would play poorly, so the players would feel bad, the players would then play poorly, which would lead to the team playing poorly, and so on and so forth. Loss after loss after loss just accumulated, and it was no wonder that indeed the Sharks would end up finishing dead last in the league. Specifically, what went wrong here? Well, obviously this roster was constructed to lose many games. Mike Grier, even though he might not admit exactly that, and he probably wasn't hoping for as disastrous of a season as the Sharks ended up getting, it was quite clear that he didn't put up a roster of players that was actually supposed to be competitive. But that doesn't mean that the players themselves are attempting to lose games. They're coming every day to attempt to win and feel good about themselves. And yet, they couldn't manage to do exactly that. Well, why is it? Well, first of all, of course, it is indeed the injury to Logan Couture, which was a massive loss for the franchise, not just because he was the Sharks' leading point scorer at forward last season, but he is also the captain of the team. But there were also a couple of other disappointments that happened at forward. Alex Barabanov, who was supposed to be at least a somewhat effective top 6 forward again for the San Jose Sharks, had a complete disappearing act this season. He put up basically no points, was a healthy scratch a frequent amount of time, and ended up just being an ineffective player for San Jose Sharks when he was actually in the lineup. On top of that, the San Jose Sharks had made a move to acquire forward Anthony Duclair from the Florida Panthers, and he was supposed to be an effective top 6 forward as well for San Jose. And while he ended up being okay and certainly better than the aforementioned Barabanov, it clearly wasn't quite at the level that the Sharks were expecting, and so while they still managed to trade him at the deadline to the Tampa Bay Lightning, the return maybe wasn't as great as they may have been hoping for. Now, with all that being said, not everything was negative from a forward perspective. There were a couple of players who were a pretty big surprise, the first of which was Mikael Granlund. I mentioned that many people felt as though Granlund was a bit past his prime, but he ended up having an incredible season for the San Jose Sharks. 60 points on a team as bad as San Jose is actually quite good, and he played in essentially every situation for David Quinn. Power play, even strength, penalty kill, 4-on-4, 3-on-3, you name it. Mikael Granlund was on the ice. In fact, he was kind of overplayed for much of this season, but who could really blame Quinn when he was putting up the performances that he was? In fact, he actually ended the season on a 13-game point streak, one of the best point streaks that the San Jose Sharks have ever had in franchise history, in a year in which the Sharks were completely terrible. So that is definitely saying something. On top of that, the Sharks actually had 2 pretty impressive seasons from 2 young wingers, giving some hope for the future. The first of which was from William Eklund, playing his first full season in the NHL, definitely picked a bad one to do so, as this was indeed one of the worst seasons the San Jose Sharks have ever had, but still, 45 points in 80 games is quite good, and on an actual better offensive team, that could have been 50, 55, perhaps even 60 points, which would be really, really impressive for a young player. And then there was Fabian Zetterlund, acquired in the Timo Meier trade, was completely terrible at the time, played about 20 games for San Jose, put up 0 goals during that time. It was a wonder if even the San Jose Sharks would look to bring him back next season on a restricted free agent contract, but of course Greer did so, as he didn't want to just completely abandon a player he specifically targeted in that Timo Meier trade, and that clearly ended up being the correct choice, as Fabian Zetterlund would not only lead the team in terms of goals, but be one of the only actual good forwards along with Eklund and Granlund, putting up 44 points on the season. But you can see the offensive issues creeping up after that, as the players who round out the top 5, Filip Zadina and Mike Hoffman, were barely even bottom 6 players for San Jose, getting healthy scratched at times. In particular, Hoffman was a healthy scratch multiple times this season, and each of them only put up 23 points. There are teams in the NHL whose 5th leading goal scorer would have more goals than the 23 points that Mike Hoffman put up. That just goes to show how terrible the San Jose Sharks were offensively this season. In fact, Tomas Hertl, who was traded at the deadline to the Vegas Golden Knights, and so he missed the rest of the season at that point with San Jose, and was even injured for a few games prior to that, would have actually been 4th on the team in terms of points in just 48 games for the San Jose Sharks. So again, offensively, this team had a lot of issues. But the thing is that it was not just the forwards who really led to this bad offensive output, because like how defense is a 5-person game, offense is also a 5-person game. And so you do have to look from the back end to see that there was 0 support coming for the forwards. Last year, Erik Karlsson was essentially a 4th forward on the ice, putting up 101 points. You don't mistakenly get 101 points. He had to put in the effort to be able to do that, and that really was a rising tide raises all ships type of situation. Erik Karlsson was a one-man show on the back end, but with him gone, there is no other Sharks defenseman on the roster who even holds a candle to Erik Karlsson in terms of offensive talent. And so, while this may not be a bad thing defensively, as no one is going to argue that Erik Karlsson was some elite defensive defenseman, it turns out that the cliche of the best defense is a good offense actually ends up ringing true. Because while none of these players actually ended up helping offensively, you might think that could lead to some strong defensive play. Nope. Turns out when you are not a player who can keep the puck in the offensive zone, and you are not a player who can actually make the first pass or even carry the puck out of your own defensive zone, you're pretty much just going to be finding yourself defending more often than not. As the first instinct for players like Ferraro, Ruda, Benning, Burrow, well, Benning I guess didn't play any much of the season, but all of these types of players is to just bank the puck out of the zone, bank it off the glass, hope you're not icing it, which just leads to your forward lines getting a change, and it leads to the other team just re-entering right away soon after. And so this means the Sharks were just playing in the defensive zone pretty much the entirety of this season. I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of the time at least was played in the defensive zone compared to the neutral and offensive zone as well. And that's not necessarily the end of the world. Teams in the past have had to rely heavily on their defense and their goaltending to win games. I remember the Los Angeles Kings back when they were a very successful franchise, won a couple of Stanley Cups. That was kind of their MO as a team. They were hyper defensive and had fantastic goaltending that they only really needed a couple of goals to actually squeak out those wins time and time again. And they won Stanley Cups doing exactly that. But just because the Sharks were playing in the defensive zone a ton did not mean that they excelled in that particular area. It turns out when your team is filled out with 7th defensemen pretty much, you're not actually going to have a lot of success. So there were maybe 1 in every 10 games situations where the Sharks actually played decently well, and that limited the amount of chances that the other team can get. But more often than not, it was just a complete open season on the Sharks goaltenders, as multiple bad seasons from players like Burrows and Jan Ruda just completely sunk the San Jose Sharks. On top of that, there was also a massive injury, as I mentioned, to Matt Benning. He was actually one of the Sharks' best defensemen in the previous season. Obviously, when you look past Erik Karlsson, the best defensive defenseman for San Jose was Matt Benning. He missed almost the entirety of this season, so that definitely did not help. But there was just nobody who stepped up on the back end to actually lead this team. And so when your forwards aren't scoring goals, your defense aren't helping out in goals, you need to have a good back end. It did not happen. So that's pretty clearly a recipe for disaster and makes it no surprise for why the Sharks finished right at the bottom of the league. Now, what is most interesting about San Jose is that their goaltending actually wasn't terrible. The previous year, when they finished fourth last, their goaltending was very bad. It was one of the worst goaltending tandems in the entire league, made up by James Reimer and Kaapo Kähkönen. This year, it wasn't nearly as bad looking. In fact, both Blackwood and Kähkönen, usually I wouldn't include a player who's no longer on the San Jose Sharks, but it felt as though we needed Kähkönen on the board to tell the full story of how the Sharks goalies performed, so here he is. Both of these goalies were actually somewhat average in this past season. Both of them were in the positives in terms of expected goals against, which means that based on the types of shots that they faced, they actually made more saves than the average goalie would be expected to make. And yet when you take a look at their stats, they do not really jump off of the page. A 3.45 and a .899 for Mackenzie Blackwood. It only got worse for Kaapo Kähkönen as well. These are the types of stats that you have when you're looking like a really bad goaltender, but it is quite clear that it was the defense in front of these two goalies who completely failed them. And had the Sharks actually had goaltending at the level as what they had last season, if they indeed had league worst goaltending, they probably would have had an even worse season, which is so difficult to imagine because the Sharks' 47 points that they put up this past year is actually the worst mark of any team since the salary cap came into effect after the lockout season in 2005. So generally, the Sharks, to conclude here, were very, very bad. 19 wins, 54 regulation losses, 9 overtime losses. In fact, if you combine those two losses together, that is 19 and 63, which means that the Sharks lost more than 3/4 of the games that they played. There was not a lot of excitement. I'm sure many Sharks fans share the sentiment with me that when you would wake up on a game day, not only were you expecting the San Jose Sharks to likely lose the game tonight, but you were almost hoping that they would do so as well, just because there was no reason to win those games since the Sharks would never make the playoffs anyways, so you were kind of just hoping that they could get the best possible odds at the draft lottery at the end of the season. And so having to do that for 82 games of a year, that's pretty depressing. But with this hopefully being the rock bottom for San Jose, you could kind of say that you can only really go up from here. Class dismissed.